I probably made a mistake because for tax purposes, being an American is really, really unbelievable.
This is Jim Baker. He's an American citizen, but he's been living in Singapore since he was 2. Before retirement, he was a teacher at the Singapore American School. During our deep and meaningful talk, he shared with me his regrets in life, why he chose not to stay in the US, and how the American expat community in Singapore has evolved over time. I'm Max, let's dive in.
How old are you now?
I'm 75.
How's your life like being retired in Singapore? Like what do you do? How's your life look like?
3 years ago, my wife died, and that changed my life dramatically. Now you live alone kind of thing, and that is a whole different way of living. In Malaysia, where I have the house on the island, the people there call me Cegu, and if you go into Bersing, everybody there calls me Uncle. There are people in the neighborhood where I live that know me and say hello. My wife was much better friends with the neighbors than I was.
How's your day look like? You go to a hawker center, like have a meal, have a beer or chat?
I probably eat 3/4 of my meals in the hawker center. But that's not just taste, that's also economy too.
Can you say that you lived a happy life?
Yeah. Very few complaints. When you're 40, what you want out of life is different than when you're 75. And so, did life give you what you're looking for at different periods of your life? And I was very fortunate that I shared my life with a wonderful woman too. So it wasn't just, it was a shared life, and shared lives are always more fulfilling and more interesting than ones on your own.
Yeah.
My son comes back here about once a year. And he has kind of found places in Singapore that, because he grew up here as well, that don't change much. Like he really likes Tiong Bahru, and he really likes Changi Village. And he knows when he comes back, they're going to be pretty much the same, you know what I mean? And so he comes out here for 2 or 3 weeks once a year, and he's found places in Singapore that he likes, and people, Singaporeans that he really has a good time socializing with.
Do you have any regrets in life?
I probably should have become a Singapore citizen. About 30 years ago or so, the government asked me the question, have you considered citizenship? And I said, well, I'll just keep the permanent residency. I probably made a mistake because for tax purposes, being an American is really, really unbelievable. I mean, they chase you to the 4 corners of the world. Very few countries tax you if you don't live, in the country. If you're an American, you and the American tax authorities are tied together forever.
Have you ever thought of going back to the US?
It's a strange place for me. When I went back to university, so I was 18, and I also went back to university during the 1960s. So there was a lot of change going on in America at that time.
Yeah.
So I was going through change, and America was going through change. I had a kind of a vision of America that didn't quite jive with what I saw when I went there to live. When I went to university, I really had no great desire to stay in America. I mean, I wanted to come back to Singapore. In my mid-20s, I went back to the States. I'd been offered a job teaching in the States. I went to where the school was, and I was getting ready, and I can't live here. And went in and said, I'm sorry, I gotta give up the job. I don't wanna live here.
Why?
The reasons I didn't like the States much, in some ways, is a problem Singapore faces today. Quite a lot of people like Asian food because it has spices in it, right? There's a spice to life. And to me, America was there's a sameness there. Although today, America has changed a lot, and the immigration of the last 20, 30 years in America has diversified America dramatically. But the same thing, there's a sameness in Singapore that has been created. The heartland, HDB land, tends to kind of be the same. There are some communities like Tiong Bahru and Changi Village. There are some places that have a real identity. But to me, that was, when I was younger, that's what America seemed like. It seemed very, very, there's a sameness to America. Today, when you go to major American cities, just think of all the different kinds of food you can find. And the immigrants that have come from all over the place into America in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And it has made it, to me, a much more interesting place and a much more livable place from my point of view. The diversity that has taken place in America in the last 30 years. For me, I mean, as a permanent resident, my savings went into CPF. I owned a home here. My health insurance and my doctors and all those kinds of things were in the government hospitals. The support kinds of infrastructure for me was in Singapore. My money was here, my doctors were here. So to go back to America, we had to start all over again. And that wasn't even a question. Because when my wife and I planned retirement, we planned to retire in Singapore and Malaysia.
What do you feel now if you, let's say, you fly to the US and you spend like a few days or like weeks in the US? Like, what do you feel? What's your feeling about like being in the US?
I went to university in Washington, D.C., and my son lives in Washington, D.C. That's the closest I have to any kind of place I call home in America. Except in Washington, D.C. I mean, there's places I like San Francisco and New York, places like that, but they're not home. You're just a tourist, you know what I mean? In many ways, that's the way I feel when I go to the States, is I'm kind of I'm more of a tourist than I am. When I was much younger, it had more of a draw to me.
How was the childhood? Was it like fun time for you? Like you did like some crazy things, like teenage years, let's say?
I kind of lived in two worlds, and that created a different reality for me than most other expatriates. Like any other teenager, you know, I wanted popular culture. And when I was a teenager in Singapore, the popular culture basically came from Britain. Because American popular culture, you know, it would be time before it really began to dominate globally. As an American, you were trying to find American popular culture. A lot of it didn't exist in Singapore. But you got the first rock concert I went to was the Rolling Stones, 1965. At the Singapore Badminton Hall. And so the groups that we listened to were the groups coming out of Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, you had some American music, but when I went back to university, the British sound came to America. And I wasn't that impressed. That's what I'd been listening to at home in Singapore. The big American cultural presence in Singapore was in the movies. So Hollywood had a presence in Singapore, but the rest of popular culture, American popular culture, really didn't.
Before Jet came in, like how long did it take for the one to, let's say, the flight from Singapore to the US?
Well, when I was very young, we went by ship.
By ship. So there were no flights?
No, but then as passenger flights increased, it would take about 5 or 6 days to get to the States from Singapore by plane.
By plane? Oh, by plane.
By ship, it was a month.
Oh, how come by plane?
Because what the plane would do is it would fly, say, from here to Bangkok.
Yeah.
Spend the night in Bangkok, and then fly from Bangkok to Hong Kong, Hong Kong to Tokyo, Tokyo to Honolulu. So it would take 5 or 6 days to get to the States.
Yeah.
Even when you started flying, you know.
Yeah. Wow.
And then 707, 747, then that revolutionized travel. It used to be very expensive to fly from Singapore to the States. Well, the exchange rate was 3 to 1. So it was like 3,000 Singapore dollars, 1,000 US dollars.
Yeah.
So 3,000 Singapore dollars, which today, I don't know, would be 20,000 or something, yeah. It's in the 70s when the prices start to come down, and then air travel became something that a lot of people could afford.
How do you think the expat community changed? Like if you see like expats or foreigners living in Singapore now compared to the ones that were living like in the 60s here?
It's much more diverse than it was. At one time, it was 99.9% white. Today, the American community has very large numbers of Asian Americans, Indians, and Chinese because of why they're here, right? The technological industries, you know, the way they're made up in America. When you export them, you get a lot of Asian Americans because of their prominence in those industries. There are many American communities now. At one time, the American community basically existed along Holland Road, Orchard Road.
Yeah.
90% of Americans live there. But now you have an American community in Sembawang, the military. You have an American community in Woodlands. You have an American community by the river. And you have an American community along Orchard Road, Holland Road area. So there's probably 4 or 5 American communities. I mean, there's 35,000 Americans living in Singapore now.
Yeah.
That's
a lot.
That's a lot of people.
Do you have any like main principle in life, something that's like very important that help you through your life, like your career or life in general?
Well, for me, I was connected to an institution for a very long time. First as a student, and then as a teacher.
Yeah.
So in some ways, living in an area that's going through such change, I had an institutional kind of anchor. I taught at the American School for 35 years. And so in expatriate communities, people are coming and going constantly, and that's the nature of expatriates. But some institutions remain, like, say, the school. I was fortunate that I got to teach the things that I studied in university and really loved, history and economics, and I wrote history. I was fortunate in that what I really liked, I got to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes people get degrees in history and end up working for banks. You know what I mean? or become civil servants or whatever.
Yeah.
I was fortunate in what I really loved, I got to do
Yeah.
my whole adult life.
Yeah.